up in, cities and towns. I'm not a country girl. I'm not a farm girl. So growing up, whenever I heard this passage, Jesus saying that I am the vine, the image that I had in mind was the little ivy that I had growing at my house. And, I love ivies, but they're house plants. And, well, I managed to kill quite a few of those, which I hear is hard to do. But, they're just a little bit delicate looking, and so I never really quite made this connection when Jesus says, I am the vine. I'm going, you really could do better than that, Jesus. However, once I, became so sophisticated and traveled the world, and I saw vineyards, I saw vines in a completely different way. And the first time that I saw these massive vines, the way that they're twisted and hooked on the wires and things like this, I suddenly heard these words in a completely different way. And I found that so helpful to finally get this. Well, even with that, I have to think that for Jesus' hearers, they heard this in a completely different way themselves. This image of a vine would immediately make sense to them. And it would have been a really strong image for the disciples as they listened to Jesus talk about that. For one thing, vine dressing and vines was a major industry for Jesus' people, for the people of that day, because wine growing, or growing grapes and making wine, was a huge industry for them. And most of them would have seen vineyards all over the place. But for a Jew, this image of the vineyard would have gone even deeper for them. They would have heard of the image of a vine and the vineyard and the vine keeper throughout the Hebrew Scriptures. If you look at Psalm 80, verses 8 and 9, it reads, You brought a vine out of Egypt. You drove out the nations and you planted the vine. You cleared the ground for it. It took deep root and filled the land. That would have had a lot of meaning for people who had been exiled in Egypt and then brought back to Israel and got their roots sunk into the ground that God had promised them. And even more so, they would have known this passage from Isaiah. I will sing for the one I love, a song about his vineyard. My loved one had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He planted it with the choicest vines. And then he looked for a crop of good grapes, but it yielded only bad fruit. Now you dwellers in Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more could I have done for my vineyard than I have done for it? And now I will tell you what I'm going to do to my vineyard. I will make it a wasteland, neither pruned nor cultivated, and briars and thorns will grow there. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. I looked for righteousness and found none. So a first century Jew would be very, very touched and impacted and get a lot of meaning out of this image. There was the literal understanding of the vines and that they carry the nutrients to the branches, and if the branch is severed from the vine, it will die. A literal translation, they got that. But the deeper meaning of this, the symbolism of the relationship between the vine and the branches, of the relationship between Israel and the God, would have really struck them deeply. And in fact, Jesus uses vineyards in several of his parables as well. So here they are in an upper room celebrating the Passover meal. It's a Thursday, and Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's been talking to them, and it almost maybe sounds to them like he's going to go away. He seems to be talking to them as though he were saying goodbye, and he was trying to give them some advice and some words for them to have after he leaves. Now, for us that know the rest of the story, we call these passages the farewell discourse. because Jesus is saying farewell to his disciples, because he, in just a few hours, will be betrayed and will be put on trial and be found guilty. But for the disciples, they're up in a room listening to this person for whom they've given up their lives, their livelihoods, and that they have followed, and they're celebrating the greatest of the feasts, the Passover feast, when Jesus takes this image of a vine and he suddenly makes himself out to be the vine, and that they are the branches. Probably they're wondering about this next part even more. Abide in me as I also abide in you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit, and you become my disciples. Why is he talking as though he's going to be leaving them, but he's also telling them to stay with him? I'm wondering if they're grappling with that, because that's really kind of the core of what this discourse is all about. And it's really a huge part of the message that Jesus has for us in our lives as well. So I want to look at this. If we look at this word abide, what's a hymn that has that?
Abide with you.
Yeah, it's a word that we know, right? It's a word. It's kind of, we don't use it every day. I don't do, it's not a common word, but it's sort of a religious word, right? But the word abide, it's a translation of the Greek word meno, which, if you want to use just a single word translation, it would mean remain, it would mean stay, live, dwell, endure, continue. You could read this passage as remain with me as I also remain in you. That's what the NIV, how they translate it. It could be stay with me as I also stay with you. Continue in me as I continue in. It's a word about connection. It's a word about relating. It really means to maintain an unbroken fellowship with. Or another meaning is to put forth constant influence upon one another. Maintain an unbroken fellowship with me as I maintain an unbroken fellowship with you. Those who are influenced by this relationship and I listen to them will bear much fruit. Whoever does not continue with me is cut away. This word that we say abide really is a word that's about this constant mutual relationship with Jesus, and whoever stays in this mutual, ongoing, continuing relationship is always going to be connected to this source of life and nourishment and energy, and as a result will constantly be bearing fruit that reflects the nourishment that they have been receiving from the source, from Jesus, from this God incarnate. We must stay connected to Jesus to find this nourishment and to find our purpose. That relationship is the core of discipleship, of what it means for us to be disciples with Jesus, and our strength comes only from that connection that we maintain constantly with Jesus. Jesus says the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine. So also you cannot bear fruit unless you abide in me. I'm wondering if Jesus knew his disciples well. I think he knows us pretty well. You know, it's difficult to stay connected to an ever-present but seemingly intangible God. It's difficult to feel that we're receiving nourishment and strength when we feel pain and loneliness and fear. There are times when we don't really understand how we're connected. We don't feel it. We don't perceive it. We don't have that sense of being able to grasp it and feel strength in those times when we feel afraid and scared. And so Jesus has to tell us, remain in an unbroken fellowship with me. He knows that in just a few hours, these disciples that he's telling this to are going to abandon him. Peter will deny him 3 times. It's only a few hours after he speaks this word to him before the disciples lock themselves up in a room out of fear for their safety, and they stay locked up in this room out of fear, even after Jesus appears in their midst. After he's been declared dead, after he was buried, after then he appears in their midst, they're hearing things. Jesus is no longer in the tomb. It's empty. We've been told that he is risen. He appears in their midst. He says, peace be with you. And they still are afraid. They are somehow missing that nourishment, that connection, that ever-present, intangible truth that God is present. If it's hard for them, oh yeah, I think it's hard for us sometimes. Maybe more often than we like to admit. I actually find that helpful. I find it helpful that these people that have seen the tangible God, that have seen God incarnate, that have felt his breath upon them, that have eaten and drinking with him, that hear these words of encouragement, hear them more deeply, more fully than we can, that even they sometimes lose sight of it. I find it helpful that other people in faith have struggled through fears and worries and doubts and confusion and anger that I struggle with at times in my relationship with God. It gives me strength and it gives me comfort and it makes me feel connected. Maybe that's the pruning. Maybe the fact that we do sometimes suffer and worry and doubt and get angry and yet still are able to find a connection with others that feel that's the source of our strength, is that we are together. And that we are seeking our roots and seeking the place where we gain our strength. Unless one is connected, one will not receive, Jesus says. Unless you are part of it, you will not bear fruit. Let me illustrate. A member of a congregation, regular in worship, well known in the community, lost his wife. And in his suffering and grief, he decided to stop going to church. He was really pretty sure nobody would miss him. So he stayed at home Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. He refused to see the pastor when the pastor invited himself over. And finally, one week, months after he had stopped coming to church, he finally agreed to let the pastor come over and visit, just to get the pastor off his back. The pastor came over one evening, and the man invited him into the living room where there was a nice fire burning in the fireplace. After a long while of silence, of not speaking, the pastor stood up from his chair, took a pair of the fire tongs, and removed a burning ember from the fire and placed it off to the side. And he sat down. The two men watched the ember lose its heat. They watched it lose its light and grow cold. And the pastor stood up and took the tongs and picked up the ember and put it back in the fire and sat down again. And they watched as the ember took on the heat from the surrounding fire and once again became bright and burning, and the fire itself became stronger. After a short while, the pastor stood up again and thanked his parishioner for a pleasant evening. And the man responded, "Thank you for visiting, Pastor. That's the best sermon you've ever preached. I will see you on Sunday. I am the vine and you are the branches. Maintain your connection with me and receive strength and nourishment and love Jesus knows it is going to be tough, so he tells us now, don't leave. Don't do it on your own. I want to be part of this. Stay with me. Abide with me. Remain with me. Jesus loves us. This we know. Amen.